Hey, it's Raz. All right, let me come back to the beginning of this. I'm not even on my slide again. It's like my MO lately. All right, so we have two cycles, the last two to get through today: phosphorus cycle and water cycle. Phosphorus will be new. Water cycle should go pretty quick because that should mostly be a review of things you guys know from probably elementary school. So we're talking about the phosphorus cycle, very similar in terms of like structure to carbon and nitrogen cycle, where we have the movement of a molecule, in this term case phosphorus, and it moves through various sources, sinks and reservoirs. The big difference here is that most of our phosphorus is contained, or the reservoirs for it are rocks and sediment. Because of that, this cycle is extremely slow. It's a ton slower than the carbon, the water, and the nitrogen cycles. So even though the carbon cycle has some slow parts, like almost all parts of the phosphorus cycle are slow. And the reason for that is because in order to get the phosphorus out of the rocks that it's stored in, or the sediment that it's stored in, it has to be weathered out. Weathering is just a slow process, and it relies on things like wind and water to actually break down that rock. So this isn't something that's going to happen very quickly. Something unique about the phosphorus cycle, though, is that it does not have a gas phase. So there's never part of the nitrogen cycle that takes place in the atmosphere. It's strictly in, our rocks and our soils and our aquatic environments. The other unique or interesting thing about it is because this is such a slow process, phosphorus is often a limiting nutrient. So we've been talking about limiting factors and limiting nutrients in class. This is a big one. Plants need this in order to grow. So depending on how much of this is present in the soil and the water of the environment is going to determine how many plants can grow. And it's really important. This is an interesting cycle too, that phosphorus is part of our DNA. It's part of our ATP, right? So we know DNA is hugely important to living things. ATP is like that biological energy molecule. So again, really important. And it's also part of like our bone and our teeth enamel, all sorts of other things. So it's a very important nutrient for all living things. So in terms of sources, there's kind of two. We'll look at natural and synthetic. The major natural source is rocks that contain phosphate. And over time, wind and rain and other forces will break down that rock and they release phosphate. So it's a form of phosphorus. That phosphate can get dissolved in water to an extent, but gets dissolved in water, and it can enter our water cycle to talk about soon, but it can be in our rainwater. That can move into nearby soil and other bodies of water. So it cycles through in that way. As a reminder, it's very slow. This is a limiting nutrient. Okay. Now, in terms of synthetic sources, so humans have learned, and part of this came about when we had to feed a large number of people pretty quickly. We learned that we could make our own phosphorus, kind of. So what we'll do is we'll mine phosphate containing rock, and we'll add that to synthetic fertilizers for our crops and also to detergents and cleaners because it's a good cleaning agent. So we add it to those. Now, I'm trying to move myself again. The problem with that, leave me there, is that those phosphates can run off into water sources. So if we have fertilizer on our crops, it rains, that runs off into a river, that ends up in our bodies of water. If I'm doing my laundry with laundry detergent that contains phosphates, which a lot of it does, take a peek at your cans and your bottles, you might find stuff. But that will eventually end up into waterways. So I have an influx of phosphorus into those waterways. Put me back there. Okay. So let's talk about how this phosphorus cycle actually works, because all we've talked about so far is that we find it in rocks. So just like nitrogen, phosphorus is going to get absorbed or assimilated by plant roots. It's going to get taken in. It's going to become part of their tissues. We then assimilate that by eating those plants, right? Animal waste, plant matter, biomass that's deteriorating, as that gets broken down by bacteria and soil decomposers, it'll return phosphate to the soil. So again, kind of like the nitrogen cycle, we get like a mini loop there, right? That'll kind of self-sustain. That's a slightly quicker loop than the other parts that you see there. But again, that loop all the same. the other side of this. I mentioned that phosphates often run off into water. It doesn't dissolve super well into water. So think about like if I were making myself like a powdered lemonade drink, right? And I add the powdered lemonade, but I put too much. Some of it doesn't dissolve in that water and may settle on the bottom, right? And I get that layer of like powdered sugar kind of at the bottom that's not dissolving. Similar process happens with phosphate. Those solids will kind of fall out of solution or just not dissolve and settle to the bottom as sediment. We call that process sedimentation. Okay, that sedimentation over time, when they get, you got that layer of phosphorus, as it gets compressed over time, it turns into sedimentary rock, right? And we know sedimentary rock is compressed sediment. It's rock that contains phosphorus now. So that's where geological uplift comes in. So we'll talk tectonic plates a few units away, but basically, you may remember from other courses that those tectonic plates, as they collide, will push land up. And that land, as it gets pushed up, forms mountains. Those mountains contain the rock, the sedimentary rock that contains phosphorus. So those will start getting weathered, and we start that process all over again, right? So it's that kind of cycle. Now, this is also something that's going to come up later on in our course, but I think it's worth mentioning now that because nitrogen and phosphorus both are limiting nutrients, it's pretty easy for us when we're manipulating those systems through human-made synthetic ways to end up with too much of them. And when that happens, we have a process that's called eutrophication that occurs. Basically, these nutrients fuel a whole bunch of algae growth, right? We get that algae that covers the surface. It's like a thick layer. You can see in that picture there, right? It blocks the sunlight. If the sunlight can't get through, the plants that are on the bottom of that ecosystem, there you go, bottom of that ecosystem, are going to go ahead and die off. They can't survive without light. The algae will eventually die off as well. So now I've killed the plants. The algae is going to eventually die down. I've got a whole lot of decomposition going on. Decomposition is an aerobic process. That means it uses oxygen. If it's using up oxygen, I'm going to have lower oxygen levels. And again, I've just killed off most of my plants that might replenish some of that oxygen level. So we get these really low oxygen levels. Obviously, fish can't, and other aquatic life can't survive in low oxygen levels, so they die off. Bacteria starts to decompose them. They use up even more oxygen. We get this positive feedback loop. And eutrophication will eventually lead to pretty much dead water sources, water aquatic ecosystems. There we go. All right. And that's just a picture. I'm going to skip it for now. All right. So your FRQ for this one, if you want to pause it and write it now, you can. I gave you a diagram. I want you to look at it, pick two reservoirs from that image. Describe how phosphorus moves from one reservoir to the other. So you have to think about the processes that happen to get it from one to the other. Again, it's all in these notes, but that image right here gives you a whole bunch of suggestions. All right, if you want to stick with me, we're going to keep going. But again, if you want to pause, go for it. All right, so we got water cycle next. Again, this is going to be quick because we know this stuff. Okay, so water, I'm skipping through a lot of this. We know that the largest reservoir for water is going to be the ocean, right? We also have smaller reservoirs in the form of ice caps, groundwater, right? The aquifers underneath that also contain fresh, usable water for humans. I'm going to skip all that stuff. It's fine. So two of our main sources of water are actually from something called transpiration. It's sometimes called vaporization. And this is the process that plants use to draw groundwater from their roots up to their leaves. So it's kind of a fancy name on it. The leaves themselves, and you can see these if you look under a microscope, it's kind of neat, have these little openings called stomata. What's stomata with you? Anyways, they have stomata, and those stomata will open and they can allow water to evaporate out of the leaf. So it can get pulled in from the ground, okay, move up the plant, they can do what they need with it, and then it can basically evaporate out of those stomata. All right. So if we kind of take all of that together, we also have something called, I don't have a picture for that, it's fine, called evapotranspiration, which kind of looks at the amount of water that's entering the atmosphere from both transpiration from the plants and evaporation from whatever other water sources it may be. Now, the interesting thing here, right, is that all of this is driven by the sun. Okay, transpiration is going to be higher when there's more sunlight because there's more photosynthesis happening when there's more sunlight, and plants need water for that, so they're going to use more, right? And we obviously have more evaporation when there's more sunlight as well. So they're both driven by that sun's energy. All right, we know the precipitation is going to move over Earth's surface. It's going to get down into the soil. It's going to recharge our groundwater aquifers. We call that infiltration as it kind of works its way down. And those aquifers and the fresh surface waters like lakes and rivers are really important reservoirs for humans and animals, right? The vast majority of water on Earth isn't usable for humans. So these sources where we get fresh liquid water are hugely important, okay? A little note on that infiltration process, that's only going to happen if the ground is permeable, right? That's only going to happen if the ground's able to let water pass through it. Different types of soil, which we'll get into later, have different permeabilities. Some are going to take a lot more, some are going to take a lot less. We also find that ground that already has good, moisture in it, hasn't been dried out, is more permeable. So I don't know if you remember over the past, like last summer, well, even now, we're under a pretty decent drought. And the concern with drought is always that if we get a lot of rain at the same time, drought makes soil really dry and it compacts and it lowers the soil's permeability. So it doesn't take in as much water. So if we get a lot of rain after drought, people are always like, yay, it's rain. But on the same token, the ground's not absorbing it. And we often end up with flooding. Side note on this, whatever doesn't infiltrate also will run off. That runoff can often carry pollutants into whatever water sources it gets to. The stuff that infiltrates goes through kind of a filtration process as it moves through the soil. So we don't have to worry too much about water pollutants like in our aquifers. Those are usually pretty clean water sources because of that. The runoff, on the other hand, All right, so you do have an FRQ for the water cycle. Again, more just to get you thinking about it a little bit. I gave you this diagram. I want you to pick a process from it, identify the process, and describe how water is moving from one reservoir to the other. Whew. All right, thanks for sticking with me, guys. I know that was a long one. Take a minute, write that FRQ. We'll talk about that in class, and I will see you later. Bye.